Most people think they understand what markets really run on: freedom, choice, the comforting belief that if individuals chase profit, the system will quietly arrange itself into order. Ask where that belief comes from, and the answer rarely changes. Adam Smith, the 18th century thinker, the founder of economics, the supposed champion of hands-off capitalism. But here is the problem. Adam Smith did not believe in the version of capitalism that quotes him today. In many cases, the people who invoke his name are the very people he warned against. Welcome to Wealth Casebook, where money, power, and history intersect, and where simple stories rarely survive contact with facts. Before we mention the invisible hand, we have to step backward, because most people have never actually been told what Smith argued, and that omission is not accidental. For more than 100 years, an economic legend has been constructed around his reputation, repeated so often that it now sounds like common sense. The legend claims governments should stay out, markets should police themselves, and competition will automatically deliver prosperity. Economists later labeled this idea laissez-faire, a French phrase meaning let it be, or more precisely, don't interfere. That story is tidy, persuasive, and deeply misleading once you examine Smith himself closely. The popular story claims Adam Smith gave us that he believed markets should be abandoned to their own logic, that he trusted self-interest more than institutions, that he viewed regulation as an obstacle and greed as a virtue. It is an elegant narrative, streamlined, confident, easy to repeat, but it collapses the moment you actually read Smith. Adam Smith never argued for the world modern capitalism claims he endorsed. Not explicitly, not implicitly, not unsay. If he were confronted with today's definition of free markets, he would likely ask when his work was reduced to slogans and who decided the warnings were optional. To understand what Smith meant, you have to remove him from the mythology built around his name and place him back into the world he observed. Smith was born in 1723 in Scotland, during an era defined not by freedom of exchange, but by rigid control. Britain was a mercantilist empire. Trade was regulated through royal charters. Entire industries were governed by guilds. Prices were fixed. Competition was constrained. Economic advantage flowed not from innovation, but from proximity to power. The dominant players were not entrepreneurs. Bad monopoly is protected, political, and permanent. Global commerce was dominated by entities like the East India Company, a corporation with privileges so vast it operated as a state within a state. It commanded armies. It ruled territories. It dictated prices. It extracted wealth under the protection of law and force. This was not an accidental distortion of markets. It was the system. And it was the system Smith spent his career analyzing. His central concern was not excessive regulation. It was concentrated power. Smith repeatedly warned that when economic actors gain enough influence, they stop competing and start coordinating. He observed that merchants rarely meet without arranging outcomes that benefit themselves at the expense of the public. This was not a hypothetical risk. It was standard behavior. In Smith's view, unrestrained private power was as dangerous as unaccountable political power, because both sought the same end: control without responsibility. What is often omitted is that Smith was never trying to design an economy driven purely by incentives. He was not constructing a mechanical system where outcomes could be predicted by self-interest alone. Smith was a moral philosopher. His primary concern was human behavior, how people justify actions, how they rationalize harm, and how social systems amplify individual flaws. Long before The Wealth of Nations, Smith wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, a work focused on sympathy, restraint, and the social conditions required for trust. In that earlier work, Smith argued that societies collapse when individuals lose the capacity to imagine how their actions affect others. Markets, in his view, were not morally neutral. They reflected the character of the people operating within them. Without shared norms and enforced rules, commerce did not civilize behavior. It magnified it. This moral foundation matters because it directly contradicts how Smith is presented today. Modern interpretations often isolate The Wealth of Nations from the rest of his work, stripping it of context and philosophy. The result is a caricature. Smith as an apostle of deregulation. But Smith never believed markets were self-correcting by default. He believed they were fragile. He believed they required structure. And he believed they could easily be captured. This is where the invisible hand enters the conversation, and where the distortion becomes most extreme. The phrase has been elevated into a governing principle, treated as if Smith discovered a natural law comparable to gravity. But Smith himself barely used it. Across his entire body of work, the phrase appears only 3 times. 3 references, none of them describe a general mechanism that ensures good outcomes. None of them argue that markets, left alone, will optimize society. The invisible hand was never meant to absolve systems of responsibility. It was a narrow observation about unintended consequences, not a universal guarantee. Smith understood that most of the time, self-interest produces harmful results. Coordination fails. Power concentrates, outcomes skew. The invisible hand was the exception, the rare case where individual motives accidentally aligned with public benefit. Smith's actual economic position was grounded in balance. He supported public education because ignorance weakens labor markets. He supported regulation of banking because financial instability harms everyone. He supported infrastructure investment because private actors would underprovide it. He argued that monopolies, once established, would always resist competition and lobby to preserve their dominance. These were not footnotes. They were core arguments. In Smith's time, the East India Company represented everything he feared. It distorted trade, corrupted government, and insulated itself from accountability. Smith criticized it relentlessly, describing its monopoly as destructive and immoral. He understood that when corporations gained the power to write the rules, markets stop functioning. As markets, they become extraction mechanisms. What makes Smith's legacy so paradoxical is that he has been repurposed as the symbol of an ideology he spent his life critiquing. His name is invoked to defend systems that centralize power, suppress competition, and externalize harm. The thinker who warned most clearly about merchant dominance has been turned into its patron saint. To grasp what Smith meant, you must accept a counterintuitive truth. He was not optimistic about human behavior. He did not believe that incentives alone produced virtue. He believed they often produced exploitation. His work was not a celebration of markets as they exist naturally, but an analysis of how icily they fail when left unchecked. Smith did not argue that greed should be trusted. He argued that it should be constrained. He did not claim markets regulate themselves. He warned they are constantly manipulated, and he did not present the invisible hand as salvation. He treated it as a rare accident in an otherwise imperfect system. The misunderstanding of Adam Smith did not happen by accident. It happened because his work was useful, but only if it was simplified. As industrial capitalism expanded in the 19th century, economic power began concentrating at a scale the world had never seen. Railroads, steel trusts, oil empires, and financial syndicates emerged faster than political systems could restrain them. These entities needed more than profit. They needed moral cover. They needed a story that framed dominance as destiny rather than design. Smith provided that cover once his work was reduced to fragments. A single phrase was elevated above hundreds of pages of warnings. Context disappeared. Philosophy vanished. What remained was a market-friendly myth that self-interest, left unrestrained, naturally organizes society. This version of Smith was easier to quote, easier to teach, and far easier to deploy against regulation. It transformed observation into doctrine. By the early 20th century, this doctrine became institutionalized. Economists associated with free market absolutism reframed the invisible hand as a governing law rather than an anomaly. Policymakers adopted it as justification for retreat. Corporations embraced it as a shield. Regulation was no longer portrayed as a corrective but as a distortion. The market was treated not as a human system but as a force of nature, untouchable, unquestionable, and supposedly wise. This reframing intensified during the Cold War. Capitalism required a moral identity distinct from communism, and nuance was a liability. Smith's ideas were repackaged into slogans that emphasized freedom without responsibility. The invisible hand became proof that intervention was unnecessary, even dangerous. Any attempt to constrain corporate power could now be dismissed as ignorance of economics rather than concern for outcomes. What this interpretation ignored was Smith's central fear, that economic power, once concentrated, does not remain passive. It reshapes laws. It bends institutions. It creates advantages that compound over time. Smith warned that merchants would always seek to restrict competition, not expand it. He argued that monopolies were not market failures, but predictable results of unchecked influence. Smith never assumed individuals acting in their own interest would reliably produce good outcomes. He believed they would often produce harmful ones. His purpose in The Wealth of Nations was not to glorify markets, but to expose how they are distorted. He catalogued the mechanisms through which cartels form, wages are suppressed, and prices are manipulated. The invisible hand was not the cure for these problems. It was the rare exception that proved the rule. This matters because modern capitalism reflects precisely the dynamics Smith warned about. Markets today are dominated by entities large enough to absorb losses, shape regulation, and outlast competitors. Information flows are controlled. Supply chains are consolidated. Financial institutions operate with implicit guarantees. These conditions do not reflect free exchange. They reflect power asymmetry. When policymakers invoke the invisible hand in this environment, they are not describing reality. They are performing reassurance. The phrase becomes a substitute for governance, a way to avoid confronting concentration and accountability. Smith would have recognized this immediately. In his earliest use of the metaphor, the invisible hand referred to superstition, the human tendency to invent unseen forces to explain outcomes we would rather not control ourselves. The parallel is uncomfortable. Modern faith in self-correcting markets often functions less like economics and more like belief. It assumes that harm will resolve itself, that abuse will self-limit, and that incentives will somehow restrain excess. Smith rejected this assumption outright. He believed power seeks expansion unless checked. History, in his view, confirmed this repeatedly. Every major economic crisis reinforces the same lesson. When oversight weakens, risk concentrates. When accountability disappears, behavior deteriorates. When markets are treated as moral absolutes rather than human systems, consequences are externalized. Smith understood this pattern long before modern finance existed. His work was a warning, not a celebration. The tragedy of Smith's legacy is not misunderstanding alone. It is inversion. He has been transformed from a critic of concentrated power into its symbolic defender. The thinker who warned against merchant influence is now cited to excuse it. The moral philosopher who emphasized restraint is invoked to justify excess. But Smith did not believe economies were doomed. He believed they were human. That distinction mattered to him. Human systems can fail, but they can also be markets, in Smith's view, function best when competition is real, power is dispersed, and rules are enforced consistently. He did not argue for heavy-handed control. He argued for intelligent restraint. Balance was his core principle. Markets should be free enough to innovate, but constrained enough to prevent domination. Governments should be strong enough to regulate, but limited enough to avoid capture. Societies should encourage enterprise, but demand responsibility. None of this fits into slogans. That is why it was discarded. Smith never promised salvation through markets. He never claimed greed would reliably serve the public good. He warned that, without vigilance, systems decay. The invisible hand was never meant to save society. It was a reminder of how rarely outcomes align without intention. Understanding Smith correctly does not weaken capitalism. It clarifies it. It shifts the conversation away from ideology and toward structure. It forces an acknowledgement that markets are designed, and that design choices matter. Smith's true legacy is not permission to abandon responsibility, but a challenge to exercise it. History doesn't recycle itself, but ignorance makes the impact just as brutal. If this reshaped how you see economics, subscribe. The past explains the present, and I'll point you to the evidence.